Hello, everyone. Professor Cornish here. Welcome to our presentation today on intermediate and graduated sanctions. Now, intermediate sanctions are a form of community-based corrections, but they exist above traditional probation and traditional parole, but below incarceration. Now, intermediate sanctions, their punishment options really developed to fill the gap between traditional probation and traditional incarceration. And really, they serve to better match the severity of the punishment to the seriousness of the crime. So, intermediate sanctions, they're not going to be for your minor crimes, they're going to be for your moderate and your severe ones. But they give an additional option for those offenses besides just putting someone in jail or in prison. Now, they are more severe than traditional probation, but less severe than incarceration. And again, they really, by making it proportional, the punishment to the severity of the crime, they also help reduce incarceration by giving more options than just putting someone in jail, putting someone in prison. Now, they do satisfy the public appetite for punishment. And really, that's because the offender is still being punished by a means that's more cost effective than incarceration. Now, later on in the presentation, we're actually going to go over what it costs to house someone in jail and prison annually versus the intermediate sanctions that are currently available. Now, intermediate sanctions, even though the offender isn't getting incarcerated, they are still being held accountable. They're still being supervised, but they're allowed to, because they're not being put in jail or prison, they're able to avoid really that stigma that's associated with incarceration. They're still able to remain in society, or if they were incarcerated and are back out, to reintegrate back into society. And they're also able to receive programming in the community that's still going to help them hopefully rehabilitate. Now, intermediate sanctions, as I said previously, they are community-based corrections, but not all community-based corrections are intermediate sanctions. But intermediate sanctions really encompass community correctional measures such as electronic monitoring, house arrest, and day reporting centers. So they're not fines, they're not community service, it's not traditional probation, it's not traditional parole. It's everything above those, but below incarceration. Now, intermediate sanctions do provide a way offenders who are not necessarily dangerous to repay their victims and communities. They're still being punished, but because they're out in the community, they're able to, if they have restitution or fines, they're going to be able to pay those. They do promote rehabilitation and reintegration into the community. And really, most intermediate sanctions are pretty low cost. And again, later in the presentation, we're actually going to go into those costs. Now, we do have some different types of intermediate sanctions, but also community-based corrections. And really, they come at three stages. You either have front-end programs, which are options for initial sentences that are more restrictive than traditional probation, but less restrictive than jail or prisons. These are going to be really the sentences that someone's going to get. Then you've got back-end programs, which they move the offender from higher levels of control to lower ones for the final phase of their sentence. This would be like parole, for example, or deferred sentence. And then you have trapdoor side doors. And there are emergency release options for like special docket offenders, generally used to relieve prison overcrowding. Now, intermediate sanctions can be used in place of this, where let's say you've got the jail is way too overcrowded and you've ran out of your ideal candidates for release, you might release someone and have them on house arrest, where they are having like an ankle monitor. Now, first, we're going to go into discussing intensive supervised programs. Now, these you can either find these in probation or parole. So when I say ISP, it's intensive supervised programs, but ISP can also mean intensive supervised probation or intensive supervised parole. Now, with ISP, it is not traditional probation or parole. It is more restrictive. Now, the offender, they're still able to be in the community. They're either on probation or parole, but they're under stricter conditions than what a traditional probation or parolee is on. They have to report to their PO, probation and or parole officer, more frequently than what someone on traditional probation or parole would have to. Now, because of this, because offenders on ISP do have stricter conditions, they've got to meet with their POs more often, they're subject to search more often, drug and alcohol testing more often. There's a lot more work for the PO in this case. So their caseloads are generally a lot smaller than POs that handle traditional probation or traditional parole. Now, really, ISPs, they focus on control through a high amount of contacts that the offender has to have with the PO. You've also got unannounced visits, such as the home or work or maybe school. Now, it's suitable for offenders that would otherwise be sentenced to incarceration. It's basically, it's like a step down. Now, also, if you have an offender that's on traditional probation or parole, and maybe they're not doing so well, they've got a lot of rule violations, their supervision may be stepped up by having them do P. Now, ISPs are really more appropriate for high-risk offenders. You're not going to want to put your low-risk offenders on ISP because it's not going to be proportional to the risk. If someone that's higher risk, if they are put really at a level control for higher risk offenders, those lower risk offenders, it's actually going to increase the likelihood that they're going to reoffend because they have too much control being put on there. It's interfering too much in their lives. So ISP, your moderate to higher risk offenders is what it's appropriate for. Now, early versions of ISP, it was felt that that increased contact between the PO and the offender that's on ISP would not only really give more of an opportunity for better control of the offender, but also enhance rehabilitation. Now, doing Get Tough on Crime, ISP switched to really being more on the control side, a lot more restrictive. They are used as a way to alleviate prison overcrowding. Because oftentimes, if let's say a probation department or even a parole department, if they don't have an ISP, the only option might be either send the person to prison or leave them in prison. So with ISP, you may not have your quote unquote model offenders on it, but okay, hey, this isn't the model person, but we're going to give them a shot and put them on ISP. So these are the people, if ISP did not exist, they would be incarcerated. Now, it's used in probation and parole to allow high-risk offenders to remain in the community, but they're under a lot of restrictions. ISP is not easy. Now, the placement, really, this is going to depend on the jurisdiction, but it can be decided by the judge or the parole board, the probation or authority or the parole authority, such as through case planning or even failure to abide by traditional probation or parole. You know, it's kind of an either or. It's going to depend on the jurisdiction. Now, I will say that ISPs do have a higher risk of reoffense, but than traditional probation and parole. But the reason why is because they're being supervised more heavily, you know, a lot more contacts to the PO, a lot more unannounced home visits, more searches, more drug and alcohol testing. If they are breaking the conditions of their supervision or they're committing new offenses, it's going to be found out more easily. You could have someone that's on traditional probation or parole doing the exact same thing, but because they're not having that more restriction, their activities aren't getting caught. Where someone that's on ISP, it's going to be caught more easily and quicker. This is just reviewing actually what I just said earlier. Now, ISP may be combined with other intermediate sanctions, such as having to go to day reporting, having electronic monitoring, house arrest, etc. ISP, it does exist not only in the adult system, but also the juvenile system as well. Now, normally the POs that supervise ISP, they're more experienced. Normally, a brand new officer is not going to be given ISP cases. They're going to be given some time to get their feet wet, to get more experience. And normally they have a lot more training. Now, as I said previously, due to really the frequency of contacts between the offender having to come in and meet with their PO more often, the unannounced home visits, the additional drug and alcohol testing, etc., these POs have lower caseloads. I mean, ISP is pretty intense. I've worked with probation officers that have done ISP, and it is a lot of work. So that's why they do normally have smaller caseloads. Now, next we're going to go into discussing day reporting centers, which day reporting centers, offenders don't just go to them in the day. Sometimes you also have evening reporting as well. So day reporting, it could either be like daytime or like school hours, or it could be afternoon or evening. Now, day reporting centers, they are a community correctional center where the offender does have to report normally on like a daily basis. Normally it is weekdays, but sometimes it could be weekends depending on the center. But they have to meet with a supervising like caseworker there. Like day reporting is often used for juveniles. So like the juveniles might have to report in and they do their schoolwork there. You know, they're doing online classes and homework and things. They might be going to appointments, things like that. But it is an intermediate punishment. You do have to attend the facility on a daily basis, and they'll be told how often they've got to be there and when. And it's for a specific length of time. And they're participating in activities like they might have substance abuse counseling, they might have social skills training, employment training. For juveniles, they might have to be doing their schoolwork. Even those that have day reporting, the day reporting center might actually transport those juveniles to school. It just depends on the facility as well as what they're contracted with. A lot of your day reporting centers are facilitated by contract service providers, so private companies or organizations that are contracted by the government to provide this service. Now, the purposes of day reporting centers, really with the heightened control or surveillance of the offender, really it helps increase their access to treatment programs. Some of these individuals, if they weren't required to go to day reporting, they're not going to be going to treatment or counseling. But also, day reporting or evening reporting, it can be used as a graduated sanction as well. So there's been times, one of the jobs I had where I was actually a contract service provider for juvenile probation, I had juveniles on my caseload who they were getting into trouble, and the PO ended up putting in a request with the judge to require them to go to day reporting. Or let's say they were having a review hearing or even a revocation hearing. The judge would put them on day reporting as a graduated sanction. Hey, instead of revoking your probation and sending you to juvenile detention, I'm going to go ahead, you're going to be going to day reporting. And you're going to be required to do this, this, and this. That same thing could happen with adults as well. Now, they also, just like ISPs, it can reduce prison jail overcrowding as well. Now, day reporting was first developed in actually Great Britain in the early 1970s, really to respond to less serious but chronic offenders that lacked basic skills and were often dependent on alcohol or drugs. Now, it came to the US actually in 1986, first in Massachusetts. And then another day reporting center opened in Connecticut in the same year. So it's often paired with probation or parole, house arrest, electronic monitoring, etc. Now, oftentimes you have like an assessment phase where they do, intake. They kind of figure out, they do assessments, figure out what programming you might need. You might have different screenings that are done. And then you'll have the treatment phase where you might receive like substance use counseling, education counseling, support services, and other various supervision strategies. And really it's tailored towards the offender. Now, next we're going to go into electronic monitoring. It's also called remote location monitoring. Now, they use really GPS. And it allows POs to monitor remotely the location of offenders. It's often paired with house arrest, and it's used for both adults and juveniles. It's either wrist bracelet or most often it's an ankle bracelet, just because you can hide it a little bit more. And it monitors the offender's movements on a 24/7 basis. Now, a lot of times this service is contracted. You'll have the state will contract with a company that'll actually do the monitoring. And sometimes there might be an additional company, like that's the middleman, because you've got the one that does the surveillance, and then they may contact a contract service provider and say, hey, so-and-so's ankle bracelet needs charging, or so-and-so's not in the area. And that contract service provider, that middle one, they're given like an app and things that they could actually go in and check on the location and then let the PO know that, hey, so-and-so missed school. so-and-so's in a non-authorized area, they left their house for unauthorized purposes, etc. Now, electronic monitoring can be used in conjunction with other programs such as house arrest. It can enforce curfew and restricting offender movements. Because if an offender is not supposed to go somewhere, or hey, you're on house arrest, or you got to make sure you're going to school, how can you ensure that's going on if you're not monitoring? Now, it's mainly used with probation and house arrest, but also um, parole can use it as an alternative to revocation as well. And next, we're going to touch on house arrest because house arrest and electronic monitoring go hand in hand. Now, with this, an offender, they're going to be restricted to their home. Now, they will be given like times that they're authorized to leave, locations that they're authorized to go to, like if they have to pick up or drop their kids off from school, or they've got to go to work, they've got to go to school, they have to go to counseling, meet with their PO, etc. They'll be given times that it's okay for them to leave the house, but other than that, they've got to stay put. And now we're going to go into residential community centers. Now, these centers do closely resemble a prison. Now, it's a minimum to medium correctional setting that offenders are permitted to leave regularly. Most of the time unaccompanied by staff, but sometimes they are. And they can leave for work, for school, or vocational programs, or treatment. And you've got two types. Halfway houses, where often the offender works and often pays rent, and the halfway house may have their own programming like counseling, job training, substance use treatment, etc. Also, there's work release, where the offender will stay in the correctional facility and they're able to leave for work or for school. Sometimes they're allowed to leave for appointments as well, but then they have to come back. In some cases, these are used as a graduated sanction. We'll go into what those are later in the presentation. Also, they can be used too if you have a probationer or parolee that their circumstances are unstable right now, like for an inmate that's about to get paroled. If they don't have a stable place to live, an option that the prison caseworker might do is put them in a halfway house or a work release center until they're able to get more stable. Or even for parole, they can be used, let's say the parolee circumstances end up becoming unstable. They lose their housing, they lose their job. The PO might have them go to a halfway house or work release until things get more stable for them. And then once things are, they're able to leave that situation. So it's used not just for your offenders that aren't doing so well behavior-wise, but also those that their circumstances aren't stable right now. So let's help them out. Let's get them stable, and then they can leave. Now, they were first recommended by the Massachusetts Prison Commission for destitute released offenders as a measure to reduce recidivism. Again, those that aren't stable, to help them basically get on their 2 feet. Now, they can, depending on the jurisdiction, serve as the last part of incarceration. Like oftentimes, work release centers or even halfway houses are used as a step down. Instead of just releasing an inmate, especially those that have been incarcerated a long time, you might end up doing the step down of either having them go to a halfway house or work release center. That way they can start getting used to being in the community again, but they still have that structure and that safety net like they used to have when they have in prison. It can also be used, again, like I said before, parolees that are lacking a sound parole plan, or maybe for a parolee or probationer, things went majorly south with them as far as lost their housing, lost their jobs, to help get them back on their feet. Also, it can be used too, again, as I said previously, as a graduated sanction. So instead of going for revocation, we're going to have you here. We're going to see if you're going to be doing better. But if you're not, we're going to go for revocation. Oftentimes these centers, whether it's work release or halfway house, they do help with vocational training and gaining employment. And often there's a lot of community services that are there. And if they don't offer any, they've got referrals that they can make. But they also help really the offender develop a strong support system as well as a release plan. And now we're going to go into shock programs and boot camps. Now, shock probation, it is a brief incarceration followed by community supervision. So we're going to put you in jail, we're going to put you in prison, and then once you did that time, now we're going to have you come out. So it's often as a deferred sentence. And then you have shock incarceration, which is a boot camp facility that duplicates the military environment. Now, really the intent of these shock programs is to expose the offender to the harsh realities of incarceration and hopefully shocking them into remaining crime-free. So you have a short institutional term of confinement that includes with boot camps like physical regimen. So really it looks like basic training for the military. You'll even have staff that were former military that are like drill sergeants in these facilities. But it's a lot of discipline, respect for authority, responsibility, and oftentimes they can help generate a sense of accomplishment. They can be used as like an alternative for probation. Like you might not have someone that's quite suitable for probation, so they might be sent to boot camp first. They can also be used as an alternative for jail or prison. Oftentimes, it's your first-time offenders or your youthful offenders. It can also be used as a prevention or intervention program or a criminal sentence to traditional probation or incarceration. Now, I will note that the first generation boot camps, the ones that were developed during Get Tough on Crime, were not effective. And the reason why is they focus so much on discipline and control that they didn't address any risk factors, any protective factors. They really didn't provide a lot of programming. So it's okay, we're going to send you this and scare the crap out of you. So hopefully you stay out of prison. But then they weren't providing them with any skills to refrain from committing crime. Where now the second generation boot camps, they do have rehabilitative and reintegrative program that have been placed into their program. And because of that, they're more successful than what they previously were. Now, as we discussed earlier, there's a high regimen of discipline, often physical training, running, push-ups, sit-ups, drill and ceremony, a lot of manual labor, group punishment, and sometimes verbal intimidation. It looks like exactly like basic training in the military. So any of you that have served in the military, if you would walk into a boot camp, it's like, oh, wow, I'm in basic again. It looks exactly the same. But with boot camps, they're designed to break down the offender, just like basic training, and ridding them of really that street mentality and then helping build them back up into a stronger, more pro-social individual. Now, they were first developed in Georgia and Oklahoma in the early 1980s, and they started as a way to address prison overcrowding. And the first juvenile boot camp opened in 1985. So now that we've gone over many of the intermediate sanctions, let's look at the costs. Because as I stated previously, one of the reasons why these are used is because they're more cost effective than incarceration. You know, these intermediate sanctions were developed, so we had something in between traditional probation and traditional parole and incarceration. We wanted more options than just, oh, well, you're not a good candidate for probation, so we're going to throw you in prison and throw the key away. Now, incarceration costs approximately, now these costs are going to vary based on the jurisdiction, as well as like the specific program. She'll have, if like facility costs, you know, electric, other utilities, you're going to have staffing costs like insurance, retirement. Depending on the facility, you might have like medical care for the offenders, food, etc. So these costs are going to vary based on really the jurisdiction, if they're actually in a building that has staff, but then also, you know, the services that are provided as well. So the costs are going to vary across the board. Now, incarceration in prison, approximately $46,000 per year per inmate. So all of these costs are annual costs per offender. Jail, approximately $34,000. Again, this is going to depend. Parole, about $3,000, a little over $3,000. Probation, about $1,200. ISP, remember, more intensive probation. So ISP probation, about $1,300 per year. Intensive parole, on average, a little over $8,000. Your boot camps, so remember, they're pretty much a prison. So you've got all the utilities, the upkeep costs, medical care, food, the clothing, and then you've got all the staffing costs, about $32,000. Halfway house is about $18,000. Day reporting, a little over $10,000. Electronic monitoring, $5,400. Now, this is going to vary depending on really how many service providers are involved, because sometimes the company that is providing the main electronic monitoring service, the PO might directly get the reports, or also the jail, because some jails also have a work release too. And depending on the jurisdiction, some detention centers also do house arrest. I know the county that I live in Nebraska, our jail does have work release, and they also have house arrest that jail staff are monitoring. So house arrest is either monitored by the jail, or if the person's on probation or parole, it's monitored by the PO. So if it's directly the government agency that's receiving the reports, it's going to be less. Now, if there's a middleman, it's going to be more. House arrest, about $400 a year. really there's no cost. Now, obviously, it's going to go up if electronic monitoring's combined as well, which in most cases it is. Now, your specialized courts, like drug courts, things like that, they're about 4,000. Now, next we're going to talk about graduated sanctions, because intermediate sanctions are not just used as a criminal sentence in and of themselves, but they can also be used if, like, a probationer or parolee, if they mess up. So just like intermediate sanctions gives, the jurisdiction more options besides just incarcerating, graduated sanctions gives the probation and or parole officers, as well as the court or the parole board, more options than just revoking the offender's probation and parole, or parole, and sending them either back to prison for parole, or in the case of probation, giving them the incarceration term they would have gotten had they not gotten probation. So it gives them more options. Now, as I stated, they can be used, just to go over some terms, revocation, it's either administrative or court action that removes the person from parole or probation status in response to them violating their conditions of supervision. And if either the probation or the parole is revoked, parole, they're going back to prison. Probation, they're getting the incarceration term they would have gotten had they not gotten probation. Now, there's two ways that an offender can violate the conditions of their supervision. One is a technical violation, so they're not abiding by the conditions of their supervision, such as they're not meeting with their PO like they're supposed to. Maybe they're going to places that they're not supposed to. They're failing drug and alcohol tests, etc. Now, a new offense violation is the arrest and prosecution of a new crime. Now, new offense violations are also technical violations because, as a condition of supervision, you've got to keep from committing new crimes. So if you commit a new crime, you're actually getting hit with both a new offense and a technical violation. Now, graduated sanctions, they're oftentimes intermediate sanctions are used, but other methods can be used as well, such as requiring someone to go to rehab or someone to go to counseling. But there's sanctions that are used for minor to moderate technical violations, for often first-time violations of conditions of their supervision, minor new offense violations, or circumstances that are proved by statute, the court for probation, parole authority for parole, and also department policy and procedure. So probation and parole officers, their departments are going to have specific guidelines on the use of graduated sanctions, like exactly what type of technical and new offense violations that they can be used for, how to figure out what ones are appropriate, etc. So in some cases, it's going to be the probation and or parole officer that's going to be using these sanctions. Now, if they do have to file for formal revocation, at which there'll be a hearing either in front of the judge for probation or the parole board for parole, the court or the parole board can, instead of sending the parolee back to prison or having the probationer do the incarceration term they would have gotten had they not been put on probation, instead of doing that, actually revoking and incarcerating, they can use intermediate sanctions. So when intermediate sanctions are used as sentences themselves, they're intermediate sanctions. When they're used to address violations of the conditions of supervision or to appropriately handle a revocation, they're graduated sanctions. So really intermediate sanctions, whether they're used as a criminal sentence in and of themselves or they're used for violations of the conditions of supervision, or instead of revoking you, we're gonna have you do this. It gives the court, the POs, the parole board, more options to deal with offenders. It gives more of that middle ground. I hope all of you enjoyed the presentation. If you've got any questions, concerns, comments, please feel free to contact me. And if there's any subject that you would like me to address, let me know. I hope you have a good rest of your day and stay safe.